Hi everyone, and welcome to Murphy's Law Garage. Today is a lazy Sunday and I don't feel like working on cars, so I'm going to teach you an important maintenance item that every person who owns a home and a two-stroke weed eater needs to know how to do. Y'all stick around.
Dang it.
Alright everyone, this is my 1997 Stihl Pro Series FS80R two-stroke weed eater. Now this lesson not only applies to a weed eater, but for instance my Stihl leaf blower you see in the background is also two-stroke. But a lot of people, even if they buy a really nice unit like this, like obviously 1997, this has been kicking around for a while, they tend to give up on them when they start having carburetor trouble. But the thing is, with a two-stroke, it's actually pretty uncommon for these carburetors to get dirty. If you're doing the right thing and you're using non-ethanol fuel and you're using a good synthetic two-stroke oil like Stihl synthetic two-stroke oil, it's really uncommon for this to get dirty. You know, just make sure you don't dump a bunch of trash in there. There is a filter inside of the tank you can easily clean. The main problem with a two-stroke is they're super temperamental to changes in elevation, humidity, temperature, so on and so forth. And it can affect the weed eater's ability to reach what's called its power band. And if it can't reach that perfect ratio of air to fuel and get into its power band, the weed eater will run very poorly. So an essential skill when owning a nice two-stroke weed eater, or even a cheap one, is knowing how to tune them. But before you tune it, there's something else we need to do. Alright, so I have y'all up close right here. I'll rotate the weed eater this way. You can see I've got my prime bulb here, spark plug. This is the carburetor with the air filter housing. And then down in here, we've got some adjustment screws. But what's really important for this part of the conversation is what's hiding inside of here. The air filter that nobody ever cleans. And you can see, even in mine, as much as I take care of it, we've got some fuel buildup from this weed eater probably just being stored in a poor position and it squirting some out. But this guy right here, which is going to be fun to pull out of here, I'm sure, this guy right here needs to be clean. Now this is not really a cleanable filter. I could put this in some Dawn, so on and so forth, let it soak, but the problem is you really couldn't oil it properly. But what you're looking for is that this isn't plugged up with grass, and you can tell this hasn't gotten so much weed eater oil on it that it's sticking dust to it and it's really bad. The inside looks really good. I don't see an issue here. A little bit of excessive oil buildup inside of this. It's not a problem, though. You could just as easily wipe this out. So all I say to mention here is just to make sure before you start tuning the carburetor that you've absolutely made sure that this air filter and air filter housing is clean. If it's not clean, if the filter is dirty, it's got stuff stuck to it and you can't get it to come clean, if it's not reusable like this one is, just stop right here and get you a new one, because anything you do going forward is not going to help. Now, I am pretty fastidious when it comes to maintaining my carburetor's tune. So right inside of my little metal building here, I've got my tuning screwdriver, and I've got my tool for changing the head or pulling the head to clean or lubricate, and then of course replacement spark plugs. And then right here I've got my Stihl two-stroke oil. Now this is all we need to do this job for my Stihl. But manufacturers over the years have decided that because of EPA regulations, especially on two-strokes, that they won't let you tune your carburetor, and they go as far as to, one, use special screwdrivers like Husqvarna tends to do, or to altogether block off your ability to get to the screws. Once they're done tuning it at the factory, they'll push either a metal or a plastic cap over the screw, keeping you from getting to it. Well, luckily that's easy to defeat. If it's a plastic one, usually you can pick them out with a nice sharp knife or a flat blade. In some cases, especially with the metal ones, you might need to take a drill bit that's a tiny bit smaller than the plug and then just hit the drill bit on it a couple of times very lightly and it'll spin the plug right out of there. But anyways, let me readjust y'all on the camera, and then we're gonna get a little closer to this, and what I'll probably do is I'll start it up and let you hear what this weed eater is doing, because I haven't tuned it in like 2 months or so, and it's gotten super hot and humid in South Louisiana, and it's angry. I'm having an issue that whenever I start it, it's getting more difficult to start, and more so whenever you go to rev off of idle, it's very sluggish to get up to its power band, which is annoying. And if you're cutting with the weed eater head and you get really deep into something thick, that's a problem, because when the head speed slows down, the motor slows down, it ain't got the oomph to push itself back up into the power band. So let's take a look at that and fix it. Alright, hopefully you could hear that well with the new microphone. But what's going on here is you see that this, a lot of people would say it needs to warm up, but I've used this weed eater obviously for a very long time. It's not normal for it to be very cold natured like this, and it's, you know, 90 degrees outside, so even at ambient temperature it should already be pretty warm. And what you hear is that if I just smack the throttle really hard, it doesn't want to come off of it. It'll sit there and bog. And if you feather it in, it'll run up to its power band. And it sounds okay at the power band, but because it's bogging down low, that means that there's too much fuel there, and it's also affecting the top end power. So whenever you have a weed eater like this, no matter which weed eater you have, you're gonna have a pair of screws in the carburetor. This one right here, this is your idle adjustment. It sets the base idle. We're not going to touch that right now. What we're concerned about is what's called the high and low screw. High on the left here and low on the right for this specific weed eater if you're tuning this one or any of the generation of FSs that were two-stroke. So what'll happen here is that once you come off of idle, the low speed jet is going to feed fuel through the carburetor to the motor. And then eventually about halfway to top end, it's going to transition into the high speed jet and give fueling for the top end on your, basically you're tuning your power band, your optimal power, and how much you're oiling the motor on top end, which is very important. But if the low speed jet is out like it is on this one, the amount of fuel that you're putting in on the top end is affected as well, because whenever it gets up on top end, the amount of fuel that the carburetor is giving to the motor is a combination of both jets, not just the top end jet. So it's super important that if your weed eater is acting silly down low but it's okay up top, don't just feather it past and leave it there and think it's okay, because you could either be running too rich or too lean. One direction you're going to foul the spark plug and have all kinds of trouble with it bogging down, but the other direction you might actually melt the top end down or destroy the bottom end because you're not applying enough oil to the motor. Now that kind of sounds silly, but with a two-stroke, you're putting the oil in the fuel, which means this motor is receiving its lubrication for the top and bottom end through the fuel that you're putting into it. So if you do this wrong and you put too little fuel and oil into the motor, you'll actually destroy the motor. So it's super important that you keep that ratio right, but not just for lubricating, because these modern oils have gotten so good it doesn't take near as much as it used to, so you don't really need to see a smoke trail like you might have with the older units. But what's also important is that you're keeping the head cool. The more fuel you can put in and still get the motor into its power band, the cooler the head will run. So that's super important too. Now, an issue you may run into whenever you're tuning yours, for instance, if it's some of the cheaper brands and some of the ones where they cap the high and low screws, is they might not even actually label. So still with this Pro Series actually even tells you what a base tune is to start with before you start tuning the carburetor. They tell you to go 3/4 turn out on the high and 1 turn out on the low, and that's a good place to start to get your fine tuning in. But some weed eaters don't tell you at all, and it's actually pretty easy to tell even without these markings where you need to find your low and high with a simple test. Now in this case I don't need to go to base settings, but just about every weed eater they mimic each other in the way their carburetors are made. So whenever you're looking at the low and high screw, once you've determined what they are, a good base setting is always going to be about 3/4 on the high and about 1 on the low. And you can actually just do 1 to 1 if you'd like to, because the weed eater will start up and idle if the high screw is too far out, which makes it easy to tune in. But if the low screw is too far out, you might not even be able to get it to idle. So let me start off by showing you, for the people who have weed eaters where it doesn't have the high and low marked and you can't find it on Google, it's pretty easy to tell which one it is. So what you're going to do is that you're going to start the weed eater up, you're going to get it running, and sometimes, especially if it's running very poor, you're going to have to get it to base settings and maybe tweak the low screw a little bit until the weed eater will idle. Once you've got it started and running, you may even need to turn the idle up, which is our lower screw here, and you can tell the difference because the idle screw, a little difficult here for y'all to see, but the idle screw, this lower one down here, is actually pushing on the throttle blade, so you can pretty easily look at the mechanism and see that where the mechanism is moving, that screw is pushing on the idle blade. Okay, so what you're going to do is we're going to start this up, and I'm going to start twisting on one of the screws. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to twist on the high side screw, and what you're going to notice is that it's going to have no effect on the low side performance. It's not going to want to do anything different, okay? Because remember, the high side screw only comes into effect in the top end of the weed eater's RPM to tune the power band and how much fuel and oil is being delivered on the top end. The low side screw controls idle and ramp up fueling. So if I twist on the high, if I'm twisting on one and that one's not changing anything when I just blip the weed eater at the low RPM, that means you're playing with the high side screw. Go ahead and label it H so you can tell the two apart. And then if I move over and you're like, okay, well that's obviously the high, and I touch the low side screw, what you're going to notice is you're going to ramp the throttles up, and either it's going to get worse and want to die, or it's going to get better and want to rev. So let me let you hear that happen. Right, you see how bad it is? It doesn't want to run. Let me show you how you can hear the difference. Alright, so right there I turned the high side screw half a turn in, half a turn out. A little bit of movement on these screws makes a huge difference. So even a quarter or a half turn, you should be able to tell that the weed eater is acting differently. In this case, I turned the high side, and you can see the weed eater wants to die if I slap the throttle really hard, okay? So next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go into the low side, and I want you to hear the weed eater actually respond to that. So did you hear that? So it went from having an off idle acceleration issue, you could hear it, I gave it more fuel actually and enriched it, and it stuttered and ramped up quicker, and then I gave it even more fuel and the weed eater ran out really hard. Now all of those little movements you saw me make were maybe a 1/16 to an 1/8 of a turn, and that's how little it takes. So it's very important to remember, if you turn that screw too much, you'll go too far and you'll have a lot of trouble trying to tune it in. So you're just making tiny movements looking for an improvement, and then keep chasing that improvement until it gets worse, okay? So what we're going to do next is the very first thing we're going to tune. You never, ever, ever, ever tune the low side first. And that may sound weird, but it's just the way that you should properly tune a two-stroke carburetor. So what we're going to do is we're going to adjust the idle and the low speed until it wants to ramp up to its high speed and get up on the power band. Once it's up on the power band, the next thing you're going to hear me do is I am going to turn that screw until the weed eater very happily runs very high in the RPM. You'll be able to hear it. And when it gets very high up on the top end, it's eventually going to do something called four-stroking. Now if it's not four-stroking and it's revving really high, then that really high rev is usually an indicator of a lean condition. So you want to get it until it revs really high without four-stroking, and you'll hear it because the motor will kind of have a hesitation, almost like a rev limiter, rather than So I'm going to get it up until it screams and then I'm going to add a 1/16 of fuel, a 1/16 of fuel, a 1/16 of fuel, which is in this case counterclockwise. Turning the screw out will add more fuel. Turning the screw in will take away fuel. I'm going to add a 1/16 of fuel until the weed eater starts two-stroking. And then the very next thing I'm going to do is let go of the throttle and watch the smoke trail coming out of the weed eater. You want the weed eater at wide open throttle to have either the very slightest amount of smoke trail or a good healthy 4-stroke. Otherwise it's too lean. But you can tell if it's correct even if you can't see a smoke trail when it's 4-stroking, because whenever you lift off of the throttle, there'll be so much extra oil left in the cylinder from it being properly lubricated that it's going to leave a smoke trail. So let's watch that. Alright, so it might be a little difficult to see because it's very bright outside. I've actually, in this case, when I adjusted the high, you might have noticed that it even ramped up off of idle better than it did before. And that's a principle of the low side screw being out. Either that or the carburetor's due for a rebuild. And that's relatively new and I take good care of it, so most likely not. It means we need to dive into the low screw and then adjust the ramp up RPM and make sure the weed eater is as happy as it can be there. You want it to, you slap the throttle, you might have a slight dead zone and then it ramps up quickly, but ideally you want not to have the dead zone. Some weed eaters that aren't as high performance may have not enough power to rotate the head up very quickly, so you're gonna have a dead zone. It's okay if you can't get rid of it, just try to make the dead zone whenever you slap the throttle as small as possible. So I'm going to tune the low side screw. The only thing I'm looking for is to lean it out until it ramps up as well as it ever had, and I'm gonna give it a 1/16 of a turn more fuel just to ensure that it's not too lean on the ramp up. Okay, just a 1/16 back out again. So watch me do that. Once we've done that, we'll have to go back to the high side and adjust it again, because remember, they affect each other. And sometimes you have to jump back and forth a few times to get this right, and that's completely normal. Alright, so you'll actually notice there, as I was adjusting the low side, you could hear when I went too lean and it started to break up and it was having trouble ramping up. There was a larger dead zone, and then I backed it out until the motor happily revved up to its top end. But what you also heard, what we couldn't hear before when I was tuning the high side, it just began to do the 4-stroke, the stutter, where the fueling is a little too rich on the top end, and that's what you want, because it ensures that the safety of the head and that the head is going to be cool even when you've got this thing throttle pegged at all times, which is what you should be doing, especially when you're cutting under load. that the head will stay cool when the weed eater is absolutely spinning as hard as it can. So I'm going to go back into the high side again and try to perfect the stroke. We want to hear some of that four-stroking, that high RPM stutter when it's at its absolute top end. Oop, help if I turn it off. Okay, so right now it's four-stroking about as much as it wants to. And normally I would call a problem with this because it's not four-stroking as much as I know it can. So that indicates to me that this carburetor is probably due for a rebuild. Or these days, carburetors can be bought for so cheap it's not worth it to rebuild them but to replace them. So my carburetor is getting a little on edge. And yours may be too, but you'd be surprised at how much life you can get out of a weed eater by only just tuning the carburetor, even if it's having some trouble, especially on two-strokes because it's so temperamental, and get a lot more life out of your weed eater, either because it's cheap and you're going to throw it away anyways because the carburetor's too expensive, or if you have an expensive one, especially if you're using it commercially, that you want to get more life out of what you have before you move to a replacement. Carburetors will fail. They'll get old. They have diaphragms inside of them that get stiff, so they lose performance over time. That's completely normal. It's not unusual. So in this case, it is still four-stroking. I can still see a smoke trail whenever I chop off throttle. So I know the head is still getting enough oil to cool itself. And as long as it's doing that, the carburetor is still okay to use. Now, the last thing we're going to do is set the idle. Generally, you want the idle speed to be low enough that the clutch isn't engaging. You can hear a tinging of the clutch on the clutch bell if it's trying to touch, if the RPMs are too high. But you don't want it to be so low that the weed eater has trouble coming up off of idle, because you can get it to idle really low and quiet, but that's not ideal. Ideally, you want to come down off of the throttle on idle just below where the clutch wants to engage. That way you always have enough idle in it that when you slap the throttle, the weed eater immediately perks up and wants to cut, rather than having to ramp up off of a very low idle, which may also result in the weed eater dying when you sit it down and let it sit, because especially if it ends up on its side, it'll flood the carburetor. So let's go ahead and fire it back up again. Now I'm going to add some idle. Can you hear the clutch? I'm coming off of idle until the clutch stops engaging, which is right there. Now, did you notice something? I adjusted the idle to where I wanted it to be. Now all of a sudden it seems like the low side screw is out of spec. That's because the low side screw actually affects idle speed, because it can add more fuel or less fuel to the air and actually create an enriched or a lean condition to cause the motor either rev up or slow down. So again, here's the dance. Now we need to go back to the low side screw, perfect our ramp up, and then go back to the high side and make sure it's okay. Alright, so in this case it wanted a little bit more fuel. I enriched it about a 1/16 of a turn, and we returned back to a nice quick ramp up off throttle. So, and then I checked the high side. I can still hear some of the four strokes, so the high side is okay. When I chop throttle, I still have smoke trail coming out of the weed eater. Now that that's done, this weed eater is ready to perform, and perform well. And if all of y'all do this, and make sure your weed eaters stay in tune. You'd be surprised at how few of them will actually end up in the garbage can when they start acting wrong, because two-strokes are temperamental. They must be tuned often. If the temperature changes more than 10-15 degrees, it needs to be tuned. Yes, they are that temperamental. So let me set up, and I'm going to destroy some of my grass right here for y'all so y'all can see how well it's cutting. Alright, you can see it cuts very well there, and it frankly doesn't care about how deep you buried into something except on the plunge cut. You'll also notice, here's a pro tip when running a weed eater, especially one like this that's designed to rev out really hard and stay there, but most two-strokes in general, their power band is at the very top of their throttle input. So if you don't bring this weed eater up to its very top end and hold it there, if you keep feathering the throttle, you'll constantly drag the motor out of its power band, and it's going to feel very sluggish and poor. You saw what I did there, wide open throttle at all times. Now the only time I would lift out would be after, let's say 30-40 seconds of hard cutting like that. Usually I'll lift out, blip the throttle a few times and let the cylinder oil up, and then dive back into it again, and that's just to ensure that we don't melt the power head down. Especially on a cheaper weed eater, this is even more important. But otherwise, when you're cutting, you need to be all out, full throttle at all times. And that's why it's important for the weed eater to be four-stroking, because if you're flat out at all times and the motor is too lean, you're going to burn the power head up. Well, anyways, guys, I appreciate y'all coming along for a simple everything that everybody who owns a home and a two-stroke anything needs to know video. And as usual, we love y'all. God bless. Peace.